Welcome to the second episode of our history podcast. On our last history podcast, we looked at 1492 and the impact that had on the world. This week, we'll be looking at Ivan the Terrible. He's probably one of the more famous Russian people, besides the Tsar Nikolai or Catherine the Great. And even with the name Ivan the Terrible, dude must have been be doing some pretty grotesque stuff to be given that name. So we're going to have a similar format as we did in our previous history podcast. Instead of analyzing an event, though, we're going to be analyzing a person. I know we sort of analyzed Christopher Columbus last time, but we were also focusing on the impact that 1492 had. So we're going to have a little bit of a different approach this time. So first, we'll be providing a little bit of context and background information for Ivan to understand what was really happening in Russia and a little bit of the early life of Ivan and his rise to power. Next, we'll be looking at his reign. This will probably be the most significant segment of the podcast because he reigned for quite some time. And we'll be looking at the events that occurred and what will be most interesting. So what will be lumped in with that will also be the wars, because it's sort of during his reign too. So that's combined as I put them as two separate headings, but they're basically the same heading. And last, we'll be looking at the impact he had on the world, however little or large that is.
So a small disclaimer moving forward, the historiography, which was a big fancy word I used last week, which basically means the body of established work on a historical subject, on Ivan is huge. There's no possible way that we can cover every minute detail of his life and reign in just the 30 minutes that we try and stick to. Since he's a person and not an event, we'll try to stick to personal things about him. So things that make a person. And, the things that make great leaders tick. Events will certainly come up, but Ivan, as the person that we're kind of scrutinizing here, will definitely be the star of the events. And the events will be looked at from his perspective. So first, let's get some context and background information as to what was going on in Russia during the period. So only a fraction of modern Russia was understood by Ivan during his reign. Modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Poland and the Baltic countries were all that composed Russia at this period. This is beginning of the 1500s. That's it. Modern Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution is way bigger. It actually encompasses parts of Mongolia and Kazakhstan and into the Middle East. This is because the Khanate Empire, which was basically the descendants of Genghis Khan, they expanded and they ruled much of Russia's territory. That resulted in a lot of isolation and separation from other Russian provinces, so it fractured the Russian motherland into different areas. They're called oblasts in Russian, but I'm going to call them provinces because I'm North American and that's kind of the same thing. So the isolation brought on by the Khanate expansion was so widespread that it prevented the Russian ruling class from acquiring access to a saltwater port. They didn't actually have access to a saltwater port until the 18th century, in the time of Peter the Great. So they were cut off from a lot of the main trade routes of Western Europe. Their main source of economic livelihood came mostly from them being a tributary to the Golden Horde, which is the Mongol Empire. Essentially, the greatest known of these provinces, or these fractured areas in Russia, was known as Muscovy, and the capital was Moscow, which I'm sure is a place that needs no introduction. People from Muscovy were traditionally known as Muscovites, so if you're ever reading about early modern history and you hear about someone being described and they're described as a Muscovite, they're Russian. So let's talk a little bit about Ivan's family and what he had to grow up with. Well, his mother succeeded Ivan's father as the Grand Duke of Muscovy, which is the title of the people in Muscovy. She served in the capacity of kind of a regent, so she wasn't actually the leader. She was kind of just in an interim capacity. And Muscovy was already really unstable. And this, her rising to the post of regent threw Muscovy into a lot of political disarray. The boyars, which were the aristocratic ruling class, instigated a lot of challenges to Ivan's mother's rule. And it's alleged that Ivan as a child was treated terribly by the boyars, which was basically a product of him growing up in the constant danger of his mother's court. His association with his mother cost him a lot of terrible treatment at the hands of the boyars. As a child, like focusing on Ivan specifically, it's said that he was really bright and intelligent, but he was also cold and cruel. There's stories of him throwing small animals like rats off the roof of the Kremlin and torturing small animals. He literally just did that because he could, apparently, and people would come across him doing it, and he'd give really no justification for it. As a historian, though, it's important to challenge whether or not these stories are true and if they actually contribute to the terrible part of Ivan's name, because facts can definitely be skewed in a way that fit a kind of pre-existing mold or way of looking at Ivan. So, nonetheless, the historical background of Ivan the Terrible can kind of explain some of his motivations. On the one hand, there was a lot of isolation due to the Mongol invasion, and that created the need for a strong central leadership. In another way, the political turmoil in the royal court resulted in the mistreatment of Ivan, which led him to pretty much have a general distaste for those in power. And lastly, he already had a pretty twisted mind, it sounded like, so could these two other things have pushed him over the brink? Anyways, in 1547, in a secret coronation ceremony that Ivan put on in spite of the boyars, he crowned himself the first Tsar of Russia, making it his personal goal to unite the fractured Russian provinces and expel the Mongol horde.
Alright, so you kind of went over that. I'll just repeated it. So I'm going to be doing during his reign. So this is probably the more significant part. So Ivan had two different reigns. For the first part of his, his reign, he was called the Grand Prince of Moscow from 1533 to 1547, like Mason said. And then this changed when he pronounced himself the Tsar of all Russians. And then from 1547 until his demise in 1584, he was always known as the Tsar of Russians. So he, all the way up to his death, he was still the Tsar. This is an exceptionally long period of time, especially because he was considered to be terrible. So I also thought I would cover all the good stuff in the wars and conflicts section. So first, the duration of his reign saw many conflicts with many different groups of people, and like I said, I'll go into that later. Some of the things that Ivan is credited for were not directly made by Ivan. This happens a lot in history.
Yeah.
If it occurred during the individual's reign, then they were automatically credited with the introduction or creation of that whatever. So with that being said, I want to note that there are some things that Ivan is credited for, such as the Moscow Print Yard, which is the first publishing house of Russia. And that's sort of like the printing press. So this allowed for mass production, mass consumption as well, even though there were a lot of illiterates, but there's also people who are literate. So they could share information that they get from other parts of Europe much quicker than instead of handwriting everything. He was actually a strong believer in arts and trade, and he was actually a very good diplomat. So his diplomacy with England is one of the best examples. He was constantly engaged in diplomatic relations with Elizabeth I. His focus, though, was to maintain military power through them and have their support. However, during times of his paranoia, the Tsar actually had a fallback plan, so if his rule was ever jeopardized, he could defect to England, and then the Queen there would protect him. Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
That's neat.
So, in 1547, there was the Great Fire. So this allowed Ivan to actually create the Tsar for all Russians. So he actually had a peaceful reform, and Ivan was actually able to revise the law for him. He also founded a standing army, which is important for domestic and foreign defense and attack. Ivan also had structures built, one of the most famous ones being the Saint Basil Cathedral. But despite all of these beneficial projects, Ivan was hardcore bipolar. He was very mentally unstable, and one of the best examples of that would be the massacre of Novgorod. So now let's look at some bloodshed. So this is I wanted to leave out, I wanted to have all the good stuff in the beginning, and then now we're going to be looking at some pretty nasty stuff. However, I don't go through all of his different conflicts, I just go through some of them in detail. So first, I thought the most significant one, because it shows the best example of his mental instability, would be the massacre. So Ivan had a special police formed, known as, I can't even pronounce, this is going to be so bad, Oprenshniki. And they were, like I said, the special police. They were extremely powerful. they were given lands and forced peasants to work and pay them impossible wages. So I saw somewhere that they were demanding up to 10 times what was possible to produce in a year. So this resulted in peasants fleeing, and the price of grain was actually rising exponentially because there was just nobody producing enough, and then people were still in demand for it. So this was the major catalyst, the peasants fleeing, for the whole ordeal. During the same time that this was happening, Ivan had started a war with the Livonians. So that's a coalition between Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden. This was already very expensive, and the bread problem was definitely not helping. There was also a Prince Andrei. I'm not going to try to pronounce his last name, but he defected to the enemy side and actually led the army against Russia. So now Ivan is having a total mental breakdown. He's becoming very, very paranoid. So he does the most sensible thing, and he tells the special police to go to Novgorod and massacre all the innocent people.
The most sensible thing.
So he was scared that, like you said, the boyars or the aristocrats and other citizens would defect and betray him. So what he did was he sent in his special police and murdered them all. The estimated number of people killed is anywhere between 2,000 to 3,000 people. And this was an act of violence on his own people. So I thought this was also like the perfect segue into the Livonian War as well. So the reason why he started the war is because, like Mason said, they didn't have access to any trade routes or anything like that. So he wanted access to the Baltic Sea to have the major trade routes with different countries. So however, after 24 years of warring, he was not successful. Essentially, Ivan did not want any peace, and his special police were weak compared to the countries of the other countries' armies. Ivan lost the land that he claimed during the early part of the wars and was unable to access the Baltic, so it was all for nothing basically, and he just suffered a massive defeat. Ivan probably had the most conflicts with the Khanites, or also known as like just broadly Mongolians. So there's different groups of Khanites, but for the sake of the podcast, I'm just going to keep it simple, and then I'll just say that all Khanites. But there are different groups, and if you're like interested, you could probably just Google it or whatever. The Khanites repeatedly raided the northeast of Russia, and eventually they wanted to invade Russia. They were unsuccessful, and Ivan was not too happy about it. And in 1552, he led an army of 150,000 people towards the Khanites. And there was a massive siege that lasted about a month, and then a mad massacre of the population after. And then in 1556, Ivan finished off another Khanite group, but both of these conflicts resulted in sort of an immersion in immigrants coming into Russia, like the Mongolians, and then this actually made Russia a multi-faith and multinational state. So not that bad. I will also mention the Crimean raids and the conquest of Siberia. This is just going to be short because I thought I didn't want to take up too much time. So in the Crimean raids, Russia won. They defeated the Ottoman Sultan and the Crimean Khan. Both had to give up their expansion into Russia. It was really close though. There was a lot of back and forth, and it was highly contested. And then also during Ivan's reign in Russia, there was a strong push for exploration and colonization of Siberia. So in this conflict, eventually they were able to win over Siberia, and they actually took it from other Khans who were living in Siberia. This was really late in Ivan's life, and after that, it sort of wavered down, but it's not important for this. And during a conflicting game of chess, Ivan died from a stroke in 1584. So that was the most
stressful, the most stressful chess game ever.
And he died.
That's poetic almost. That like someone like that just dies playing chess.
Yeah, a strategy game.
Oh my gosh. All right, well, so what's so important about Ivan? Why do people need to know about him? Why do we study him? And why is he so popular? Well, first, let's take a look at some of the things that he's most generally credited with, because they're pretty big accomplishments. One, he's generally, accredited to conquering and reclaiming a lot of territory that would later comprise the Russian Empire, obviously, Bolshevik Revolution. Other rulers, of course, can stake a claim to this as well, Peter the Great and Catherine being one of them, but Ivan's kind of seen as the beginning phase of this territorial expansion. So that's huge. He's also credited with unifying and centralizing the economy, but also the government. So he took a really fractured Russia and he united it. And he starts the era of divine right in Russia, which is, you know, it was behind Europe at this point. They didn't have divine rule until like 200 years after the rest of Western Europe was doing it. But are these things that we generally remember him for? Are they a fair estimate of his worth? Well, the facts certainly seem to think so. Because after Ivan's death, Russia's thrown into what one historian has called economic and political ruin, which I think is a testament to how strongly centralized his rule and economic policy really was.
Times?
The times of trouble,
Yeah, that's what it was.
Yeah, there's like a I think it's almost like a 50-year period where like there's no leader, and
because you had like that son, right? He had the son who was not fit. And
Not
then
at all,
after
no.
that, his son didn't have a son,
yeah,
and then it was just shitty times.
exactly. So like his reign was so central. Like he was like a key cog in that machine, if you want to think about it that way. So that once he dies, like there's nothing keeping it afloat. But I don't think it's fair to blame all that just simply on Ivan dying, because that's something that comes up multiple times in Russian history, but also world history. But I mean, Khrushchev succeeding Stalin later, like in the 20th century, that resulted in a huge famine. And it even happened when the three other successive rulers, like Andropov and Chernyenko, succeeded Brezhnev. So it's not really a unique phenomenon. The big question, though, is whether or not Ivan was actually terrible. And here it's kind of important to challenge some conventional ways of doing history. With a name like The Terrible, it's pretty easy for his legacy to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. Psychohistory, which was a huge trend in the mid-90s, loved to psychoanalyze and provide Freudian explanations for powerful figures. A popular victim of this kind of psychohistory analysis is Hitler, and to an extent Stalin as well, if you want to keep it Russia-specific, that is. Psychohistory and the whole psychological approach to history tends to look at the dark side of human nature and hence their terribleness. And I think Ivan kind of falls victim to this as well. It's easy to take a rumor of Ivan's childhood as true and use it to justify the whole terrible moniker. So again, with the whole account of him just throwing rats off the roof, it's easy for someone to find proof of that and just point and say, you know, look how terrible he is. Mm-hmm. But that being said, he was a particularly unstable guy. So Xavier, you mentioned his mental health and his paranoia, and how everything was an attack, basically. And violence was a mainstay of this regime. So every time he conquered new territory, he would completely wipe out the ethnic population anyways. So it's not like he was a peaceful person. But he definitely did rely on the threat of death to remain in power. So I'm going to say that for the most part overall, despite a lot of the bloodshed, I don't think terrible is necessarily the right word to describe him. But Xavier, you covered his reign and the wars that he was involved in. What do you think? Do you think he's terrible, or do you think he's misunderstood?
So I was actually just reading this just earlier before you got here. I actually read that the word that's used to describe Ivan is actually the word Grozny, which is actually an old English translation which relates to different usages of the word terrible. It can actually mean dangerous, powerful, or even formidable.
Ooh.
So the word terrible, like in current days, is sort of surrounded by evil and treachery. However, I don't think this was the intended purpose of the name at the time. Just because it's the actual use now doesn't mean like that's what the people then thought. Furthermore, there's also an archaic usage for the word Grozny. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Do your best.
Which is used specifically for the Tsars, actually. They found this. So it actually means that they are courageous, magnificent, or even keeping enemies in fear. So
That's really significant, actually.
yeah, so it's like maybe they're not actually thinking that Ivan is terrible. They actually think he's great. It's like Alexander the Great, sort of. But like, in his situation, he's courageous or magnificent or something like that. So it's like there's a lot of stuff lost in translation.
Well, because power is an ambivalent word. Like, you can be good powerful and you can be bad powerful. So it sounds like this was an ambivalent word that people kind of put a negative connotation on.
Because maybe of the rumors of him when he was a kid.
Right.
So, also looking at his actions, they actually weren't all that bad. So in history, when we look at leaders, I feel like we have to compare them to other leaders. It's hard to not just base them by themselves there isn't really anything to relate them to. It's more of just a review on the individual's actions then. So we'd have to basically correlate them with other leaders. So I'd say that he's definitely a bit off the rails, but to be terrible, I feel like you'd have to be Hitler, Vladimir Pale, like you said, Stalin or something like that. I know like Ivan did do some pretty terrible things, but he was extremely mentally unstable, and his actions compared to those others are not terrible in my opinion. So he's Ivan the Misunderstood in my eyes.
Yeah. Okay. So that's the wrap up for our second history podcast. We're not quite sure what we're gonna do for our third podcast, but that's in development. Next week we'll be doing, what's on the docket for next week?
It's Captain America.
We will be doing a Captain America preview. So we have read Civil War. We've taken some notes and some thoughts.
Oh wait, no, that's today.
Yeah, you're right.
That's
awkward.
tomorrow, actually. Yeah. Okay, so tomorrow is gonna be. So on the 21st, we're gonna be releasing Captain America preview.
Okay.
And then there's gonna be Ivan. Actually, I have the calendar right here. And then after Ivan the Terrible, so after you hear this podcast, the next one's going to be the Assassin's Creed podcast that we recorded a while ago.
Yes.
But that's going to be exciting.
Okay, yeah, so keeping in with history, obviously, get excited for some Assassin's Creed, and thanks for listening.